So here I've started to bring it all together, and I start out by talking about Myers-Briggs being well known, but referencing it, clarifying that it's an indicator of personality, not a test. And then I bring in the allegations of poor psychometric validity. And these are all based on the references that have been provided to you within the vital folder. Then I start to bring in the new law reference, which was the textbook, where she talks about how we should be adhering to standards. And then I talked about the academic community being reluctant to adopt the test. And I've given examples of the rate to which the MBTI has progressively fallen in use since 2007. And I've talked about the scope of search as well. And then I've brought in the Fernan paper to challenge those data to say, well, if they are both the same, then why are academics not using it? And then I make the statement that typology has fallen out of favour. But, given that they're still using the MBTI for very many diverse different areas, it's difficult to know to what extent the academics involved are actually adhering to the correct principles of psychometric testing conditions, which Laura and others talk about. So here we have how the essay is built. Now, I haven't started at the beginning and worked towards the end. I sort of started in the middle, really, if you like. So I haven't really talked about Jung, and I might want to bring a little bit of that in to the discussion. So what I've done is, then I've gone back to the start of the essay and then framed what I'm about to present in terms of the Jungian approach. And you can see I've actually kept it quite tight and quite brief. I'm going into a lot of detail about Jung because the purpose is to have as many new, different pieces of information to build your argument. Because an argument is always stronger if it's got more evidence than if you actually rely solidly on one particular or two particular pieces of information. So this argument about the MBTI that I've created along with Costa McRae's Big Five interested me. So I went away and had another look to see what else I could dig up. And we know that the Big Five has a number of problems, well-documented problems with it, that have been reported in many different environments. So he based his work on Cattell's 16-factor personality measure. And none of these measures have life scales or social desirability scales either. But they don't receive as much criticism as the Myers-Briggs measure. Costa McRae themselves argued without much evidence that such scales are of limited use anyway, and that's why they don't include it in their Big Five, although some commercial organisations have recently added one. So we've got this Reed and Caesar in 2001 reference, and they actually examined the difference between those who had high scores on social desirability on the Big Five, which is called the NEO measure, and compared it to those who did not, and they found no difference in work performance. So these social desirability scales, we have to question their relevance perhaps because they don't seem to be related to work performance. But on the other hand, the Big Five stroke NEO measure is at best a weak predictor of job performance anyway. It only predicts 0.19% of the variance in how someone performs at work. So you might anticipate that other such related scores wouldn't predict either. But there's still an issue around this because employers do use them, and people could, for example, decide to intentionally raise or fake good their conscientiousness scores within the NEO Big Five measure, and thus the results would be flawed. So on one hand, the lie scale stroke social desirability scale doesn't seem appropriate because these measures are really supposed to be about having a discussion and asking the right questions. But if you are going to use it to select people Without the social desirability scales, potentially they could be quite unreliable. And one of the major criticisms levied at Costa Macrae is their theory seems quite enormous in nature. They've been very forthright in arguing for their measure, and they've made some very interesting and largely unsubstantiated statements to support their measure. For example, they have said that personality doesn't change across time. It's fixed around your 20s. There's very little evidence to support this. As we've talked in our previous lectures, people who self-identify as extrovert in their 20s will certainly change their ideas about themselves and their personality by the time they're 30. We know that older people's openness to experience decreases with age. So without a serious longitudinal analysis of the Big Five, these kinds of statements are quite difficult to evidence, quite difficult to buy into. He also argued that culture and environment plays a very minor role in your personality, and that genetics are the major predictor. And this goes against psychologists who say that actually it's the interaction between the environment and behaviour, such as Walter Mischel. Costa Macrae completely ignored his work, and the work of others, such as Karen Horney. He argued that women's personality is actually a byproduct of an environment in which they feel undervalued. And Costa Macrae were so relentless in campaigning for the Big Five, it did actually lead to suggestions that they were quite commercially aware of their method and wanted to promote it. And if Costa Macrae were actually correct in their ideas that they had developed a measure of personality that holds across time, across situations, culture, and even the evolutionary epoch, then studies of personality have thus been concluded. Gosh, what a find. Of course, these arguments would seem to be very lacking in evidence, and Jack Block in particular has lobbied 5 broad criticisms at their model. Now, these have been reported posthumously by McAdams and Walden 2010, but effectively Block argued that the Big Five is lacking in theory. Now, you cannot say that the Myers-Briggs measure or the Jungian type indicator are lacking in theory, because they are both based on a Jungian model. And also that it relies too much on factor analyses. There are many criticisms about the way in which factor analysis has been used for the Big Five, and I myself have found that it's very difficult to actually generate 5 factors from large corpuses of data. But that's not to say that factor analysis itself is a bad technique. Factor analysis can generate an awful lot of nonsense data when it's used incorrectly, but when it's used correctly, it can be a very effective tool. Block also argued that they'd left out an awful lot of important traits. The 16PF, which was the Cattelian measure, does try to cover a much broader range of different personality traits. And if you remember from the first lecture, we talked a little bit about, you can get a very high alpha by asking lots of questions that are measuring the same thing, but actually what you're measuring may not be particularly stable, and that breadth is important for understanding human behaviour and human personality. It also failed to take into consideration critical developments in trait theory measurement at the time. And Block also argued that it may even be superseded by a 2-factor approach. Basically, Costa Macrae factor analysed the 16 factors of Cattell, and what's to stop them analysing their own, write down and write down and write down. So it's a reductionist model, if you like. Now you can see here how I've brought everything together. So we've got the opening paragraph on Jung, and then we start to talk about Myers-Briggs and its utility relative to the Big Five. Here we then got examples of where the MBTI is used, And then I've started to say, and similarly, Costa McCrae's arguments that personality is transcontextual. And I haven't finished this because I didn't want to provide too much information for you, but you can see how you can start to use those arguments again to build a more powerful argument. So in evaluation, both Cattell and Costa McCrae used a lexical approach. And this is one of the breakthroughs that I alluded to earlier in terms of the criticisms that have been levied at them. One of the problems with using this lexical approach is that it relies very much on language use. The idea being that if something is an important construct, humans will have used an awful lot of words to describe that construct. But of course, the problem with this idea is that it really suggests that education and those who are educated are going to have a much richer use of language, and therefore we could end up potentially modelling personality and a few very limited constructs that are used a lot by some very educated people. We need to be careful that we're actually able to encapsulate all important facets of the phenomenon. And the second thing is that factor analysis is not a truth indicator. As I've said, it can generate completely mindless results. It is heavily used in questionnaire development, but it has to be used appropriately and correctly for it to make any use. So the other problem, but of course, is that Block and others do seem to hold the Big Five and the Myers-Briggs type indicator up to very high standards, which most of the rest of the field of personality psychology also falls short. There are many other well-known approaches to personality measurement, including Eysenck's work, which it uses factor analysis, which does other things that aren't necessarily making them demonstrably better than these measures. But psychologists have actually spent an awful lot of time critically exploring Costa McCrae's work and Myers-Briggs' work, and also the work of Cattell. So, to sum up, personality and intelligence measures, whilst interesting, should not really be the first consideration for employers or educators for that matter. But it doesn't stop them from using them. But a more accurate predictor of performance would be the extent to which candidates can demonstrate their competencies. So, for example, must have good communication skills versus must be an extrovert. Why would it be logical to ask someone like that? Similarly, asking someone to complete an intelligence test when you have their CV. You've got demonstrable evidence in front of you about things like communication skills, abilities, etc. So why test them? And if we put this emphasis on unchanging personality as a predictor of performance, employers are not very likely to invest much in the way of development, mentoring, and training. And we have to avoid the categorization that goes along with these things. What message does it send when we put people into categories? We don't just want your time and effort, we want your whole self. And labeling does not equate with understanding. This is a real danger in thinking, because just because we've labelled personality doesn't mean at all that we understand it. And if you ask a question to someone, it must be because you're interested in the answer. Whereas dividing people into categories, this kind of differentiation, actually displays a heartless indifference to the answer. And finally, the Myers-Briggs type inventory and other measures have never really been analysed in a long-term study that explores adaptability or performance within the workplace. So until that happens, it's very difficult to come to very strong conclusions about their effectiveness or their utility. We also need to be concerned about the legal side of assessment. It's a very controversial area. There are many legalities in assessment, and particularly biases against minorities and gender differences. So, for example, in the Eysenck personality scale for psychoticism, males will typically score 1/3 higher than females. So again, you can see that there's an issue there in terms of interpretation. And these gender differences play out. As I've said already, there are many eminent psychologists who argue that the female personality is something unique to the experience of being a woman. And gender differences still matter. They matter in the workplace, they matter in education. I've used this cheesy slide which shows the woman's brain full of makeup and hairbrushes and the man's brain full of pliers and screwdrivers. It's a sort of an ironic meme. It's very genderized, but you can see persistent differences throughout the literature which demonstrate gender bias, gender discrimination, and it's important that we take these matters into consideration when we're doing any kind of testing or any kind of research study. So, for example, let's just start with individual differences in the study of personality. Costa McCrae, heavily criticised, lots of papers writing about the problems with the measure. They're discussed in all psychology textbooks. Isabel Myers-Briggs, on the other hand, is in 1 of 5 books in my office. Raymond McCattell, he's in all individual psychology books, and he in particular has a glowing praise for his work and his landmark contributions to psychology. And in 1997, when he was 93 years old, they were about to give him the APA Gold Medal for Lifetime Achievement, which is a very rare accolade, and only stopped at the last moment when they already knew, but they just took a public stance against the fact that he was a fascist and believed in the eugenics movement. Karen Horney, on the other hand, has made an enormous contribution to the study of women's personality, which argues that a woman's personality is a product of growing up in a society which devalues them. She's not mentioned in any of the individual differences textbooks that are within my shelves. We can also see gender differences playing out in academia. Gender bias favours male applicants over female applicants in the prioritisation of quality researcher, but when they look at the quality of proposals, they couldn't make any differences, only when they knew it was a man. Female academics are more negatively impacted by student evaluations than male academics. And going on to this, McNell has also found that when students think an instructor is female, they rate her lower on every aspect of teaching, including objective measures such as the timeliness in which instructors return the assignments, which is something that is set in stone and everyone adheres to, but they still get marked down on that, even though there can possibly be any difference in performance. Moss and Roshan in 2012 did a study which demonstrates that male applicants were considered significantly more competent and hireable than identical female applicants. And participants also selected a higher starting salary and offered more career mentoring to the male applicant. Right through psychology, right through many research papers, you will find persistent gender differences in studies. So it's critically important to take these matters into consideration when you're doing any kind of research study. Often in psychology, because it's a largely female-dominated discipline, you don't get the gender split so much in your data, but it's still really important to think about the ways in which perhaps facets of your work could be impacting in a way that could be inadvertently causing gender bias. But it's not just men, women are sexist too. We've got some studies here that demonstrate that over 60,000 women and men were examined for their evaluations of current managers as well as their preferences for male and female managers. Women judged male bosses more favourably. They prefer male over female bosses more than 2 to 1. And there's no rational reason for that. There's other studies that have reported the Queen Bee responses among policewomen with low gender identification, but those with high gender identification had more increased motivation to improve opportunities for women. We also reported that women in management and organisations are not friends, they don't cooperate with one another, they don't support one another. And women, consciously or unconsciously, engage in negative evaluations of senior women. So what this suggests is that rather than supporting each other's career development, this sort of idea of solidarity between women doesn't really exist. And it's just not common. And women consciously or unconsciously engage in negative evaluations of senior women and negative interrelations. Why is this? Well, again, this comes back to this idea that women's personality is a facet of their environment in which they feel unvalued. And relative to males, female identity is relational. There are lots of ideas about how we should relate and care for one another. You only have to walk into Waterstones to see a wealth of books on caregiving, being a mother, and making cupcakes. There is a stronger pressure to conform than there is for the male gender. And of course, aggression plays out differently in women, even though women will say that they are very anti-aggression. They do behave aggressively in the form of social manipulation, such as cliques and the in crowd, and I'm sure many of you have experienced some sort of negative experience on social media. Of course, none of this is surprising because women are born on the same planet as men. Men do treat women in a particular way, but women are exposed to the same kinds of biases and messages, so it's not surprising that they behave in this way. At work, women do work well in teams, and they will work tirelessly not to offend people, to please people, but they're also more likely to be untrusting of one another and use social manipulation. Women view aggression in the workplace just as negatively as men, but they're less likely to admit that they've been aggressive and less likely to respond with feelings of guilt or regret. And of course, none of this is correlated with education or finance. The major predictor of female hostility is their own satisfaction with themselves. So if they are less optimistic, if they have lower self-esteem, if they are more body conscious, that will predict female aggression. What can we do about this? Well, there's many more opportunities within work environments to try and create spaces that are supportive to women. And this allows women to express anger, but not demonize other people, to be more realistic about their expectations of other women, to create distance from toxic relationships and stop people pleasing, and that learn to believe that it is actually okay to compete. So compete. It's okay to say, I want to win, I will have this, I do want that, and refuse to engage in gossip, shunning and withdrawing. And there are a number of great leadership development programs that now try to install these kinds of values and behaviours within women so that they can progress. But from the perspective of understanding personality measurement and how it can actually predict performance, there's no measure that can really tap into those tendencies to use social manipulation, to be less trusting. So it's very important that we start to expand our idea of what personality theory is in the workplace and relative to the gender differences and other lived realities that take place. So finally, what have you learned? Well, the correct selection of any test is critical. But it's not just about personality and work, but it's also about the test that you use. You should check and report the alpha when you're doing your dissertation. You often will get this within the results section. I've put an example here. This is a scale known as the Facebook Intensity Scale. And you can see here we've got Cronbach's alpha listed. But also think about whether the alpha is appropriate and think about gender differences, not just in testing, but also in the environment that surrounds us.